Hello and welcome. It's the 310 to Left podcast, the fastest moving train in baseball. And usually it's just the locomotive and the caboose. That would be me and Alex Spear in some order. But we've got one of those fancy, like first class Acela cars in between us today. It's Will Middlebrooks who joins us for kind of a first half review. First of all, Alex, how you doing?
I'm great. I'm actually, I think of Will more as the dining car, right? Like he's going to be the one to bring like the things to really chew over, the substance of this whole thing.
Yeah, see, I was thinking more like the bar car. He's gonna, it'll be sort of sour. It'll be, and then you won't remember any of it 2 days later.
You can't
Will,
really
how
see
you
it
doing?
the picture is small, but there's a ton of whiskey back here behind me. A little tequila.
I would expect nothing less. There you go. Thank you. Shot full. Well, we bring Will in because, Will, you do a great job with us on Nesson, and it's hard to believe that by the end of this Blue Jays series, we will have seen the Red Sox play 81 games. We are at the mathematical midway point of the 2024 season, and I always wonder, you guys have done this a long time. You never want to say, as you guys know, you can't say it in the studio. Never say a game is going fast because I'll get you fired, because that will jinx the game and it will go 20 innings and there'll be 2 rain delays. The most important question I guess I have to start is, can you jinx a season? Because it seems like this season is flying by.
Not in today's game. Not with the pitch clock, right? It's like long games are 3 hours now instead of 4. Yeah. So if we have a 3-hour game, we have a 3-hour game. It's because we're scoring runs, which lately that's been the case with this team because they've been scoring a lot more runs than they had earlier in the season. But if the 3-hour, 5-minute game is considered long, count me in for that.
Yes, Tom, you can jinx it, and don't mess this up for any of us, please. But I think that I'm totally with you. Like the pace of this season has been surprising. I think it's because it's been interesting. It's been unexpected. The season has not unfolded according to script, right? The thing that will make seasons drag is when you have that circling of the drain over the last month of it, right? Like if you have September of 2023, that feels like a very long time of the season. But when you have a team that's kind of ascendant, then there are lots of different things that are interesting to pick apart rather than like each game feeling like paint dripping.
Well, and that, right? I mean, hang on, let's start there because I think that the word I use is fun, right? I've heard the word resilient a lot, but I mean, it's certainly, as they've played better here over the last weeks, and the Phillies and Yankees series really seem to give the young team a jolt of confidence. But it's a fun team to watch. It's a fun brand of baseball. Even when they lose, they are rarely blown out. They steal bases. They advance runners. They seem to have simplified their approach a little bit at the plate. Will, this has been a fun team to watch, hasn't it?
It has, and I think obviously we're very caught up in the last 2.5 weeks that they've been really good, right? Starting with the Phillies series. They're coming off a tough one in Chicago where they split with the worst team in baseball, and you're going, this is about to get ugly. Like, this is the point where we fall off the edge of the cliff, because it felt like they were hanging on all year up until that point, whether it was injuries, where it was guys not playing well, where just the up and down, the peaks and valleys, and the valleys seemed like they were getting lower at that time. Then obviously they've rattled off this last couple of weeks of good baseball. And so yes, those last couple of weeks have been impressive, but I think I was more impressed with just how they did tread water and how they stayed competitive when they were at their worst. I think we talk about the players a lot. We don't talk about the coaches unless it's going bad. So I want to give the coaching staff a little bit of love here, because looking at this team, I feel like this coaching staff and TC, we've had these conversations. We feel like they went against the grain. They went against the league trends, right? Whether it was Andrew Bailey coming in and saying, look, the league is throwing velocity, throwing 4-seamers. That's what you guys have been doing. That's what the league does. That's what they tell you to do. We're not going to do it, because what I know and what I've learned about pitchers and the way you release the baseball, it doesn't work. It's going to make you a worse pitcher if you throw that pitch. So they kind of went away against the grain in that trend. And then we've started to see, as the reports come out of Pete Fatsi and Alex Cora having individual hitters meetings with the hitters. That doesn't happen unless you are really struggling, right? But they're doing it as in every series thing. First day of every series, instead of having just a massive team meeting and it being a cookie cutter, here's the approach, here's who you're facing, this is what you need to do against them. They're putting in the extra work and going in individual and say, here's your approach. we're going to build this to your strengths, not to the pitcher's strengths, because that's when you fall into trouble. It's like if you're facing a really good sinker, if you're facing Derek Lowe, he wants you to say, oh, I got to hit the sinker, because then you're going to fire it off your ankle and have permanent lumps on your shin like I did, because that's what I did, was chase sinkers in. They're building these guys up, and they're shaping their plans at the plate to their strength. And it's each individual, which is not cookie cutter. It is everybody's different. And I think that is how they are, like, getting the most juice out of the fruit, right? Getting the most talent out of each individual guy. And when I say going against the grain on the hitting side, it's still the 3 outcome at bats, right? Homer, walk, strikeout. It's still big on every team. Teams still pay the power hitters. They're not paying guys to hit 320 with 5 homers. They don't care about that still. Even with the shift being gone from baseball, you saw averages go up a little bit last year, not a ton, because hitters are still stuck in their ways. This team is going against that, and part of that is the personnel. Yeah, I get it. You don't have big thumpers. Costas will be back. Hopefully he does. O'Neill stays healthy. Great. Devers, he does his thing, but it's mostly a gap-to-gap, singles, doubles, walks, steal bases, manufacture run team. And they said, you know what? We're going to go against the grain here and play old school baseball, and it's working.
I want to take a step back. You mentioned the coaching staff and the fact that they have the individualized meetings in order to work with hitters. And I like that you brought up that question of focusing on strengths, which is also really what Andrew Bailey and the pitching staff have done, right? Like, you're not Tanner Houck. Your 4-seamer is not as good as everything else you throw. Don't throw the 4-seamer. Throw the sinker. Throw the slider. Like, throw the slider and then throw the slider again. It's particularly interesting to me. You talk about shaping coaching to the group. How much do you think that the fact that it is a young group, like, you think about when they implemented the team-wide hitting meetings, that happened in 2018 when it was JD Martinez coming on board to join a group that included guys who were kind of getting along 4, 5, 6 years of big league experience with the Jackie Bradleys and the Mookies and the Xander Bogartses. How much do you think that idea of simplify, like, narrow things down to what you do well, is really kind of the right note to strike with young players?
Yeah, well, so team-wide advanced meetings have happened since I got to the big leagues in 2012.
Sure.
So it probably started even before that. Was the first game of every series.
I'm referring specifically to daily meetings, which started in 2018.
Right. Okay. Got you. Yeah. So I think, to the latter part of that question about the younger players, is obviously when you're young and in the big leagues, you're still developing, especially this group. It's not a ton of like highly touted prospects. It's guys who were considered 4A players until they made a splash in the big leagues this year. And they're moldable, right? Like, this is the time in their career. It's like to compare it to my kids. I want my kids to learn Spanish, right? I live in Florida. So we have a babysitter who's here with them when we travel, and she's bilingual. And I ask her, only speak Spanish to them, because they're moldable, they're young, they're going to soak everything in. That's the same thing in the big leagues when you get up there and you're 22, 23 years old, and you're trying to learn how to be a big leaguer. You're still developing into a big leaguer. You have all this experience from the minor leagues, but you don't have the wealth of information. You don't have the best coaches in the world. You don't have all these tools and resources that you have as a big leaguer. And once you get there, if you are pushed in the right direction, which by this coaching staff, and this is all bias aside, the conversation I've had with Pete Fatsi, obviously I know Andrew Bailey from my years of playing with him and then getting to know him as a coach, which is completely different. Listening and watching him work in depth and looking at their platforms and their systems they use to nitpick every single detail in these guys. They don't necessarily tell these guys all these things. I think they sift through it and find what works for each guy. And that's what goes into these individual meetings, is saying, okay, everything you can possibly want to know about your arm angle, your release point, your spin rate, everything, how your body works and how you, quote unquote, unwind, how you let go of the baseball. Here's 3 things that are going to help you be your best out of the 1,000 things we have. So I think those individual meetings are first put in place to find out what works for the individual. So let's say Jarren Duran, what works for him? Well, they eventually got to a point where he wanted more power. Well, they found out his timing was better with a leg lift. So they went back to the leg lift. Okay, now that's mechanical. Okay, now we're going to get into approach, because I feel like a good approach and a good plan at the plate will buff out just about most minor mechanical deficiencies of a swing if you have a good approach. Because if your direction and your mindset is to the big part of the field, which we've seen him When he's in trouble, what does he do? Ground ball to second base, right? Ground ball to the right side, weakly hit. When he's locked in, which goes with a lot of these players, that seems to be the one constant with this group is middle of the field, opposite gap, right? And we're seeing a lot of hard hit line drives there. If you hang something, they'll bang it, they'll pull it, but they're on the fastballs and they're on the big part of the field. So I got off the tracks there to your question. You got me talking approach. We got blood flowing a little bit. But the main part of these meetings is to find out, really get to know the individual, because you can't do that in a group setting. You just can't.
But you said, in 2 words you said there, a few words, but getting to know the individual, but you also said mindset in the middle of that, right? And we had Alex Cora on this last week, and we talked a lot about mental health. I mean, that was kind of the entire thrust of the conversation. And he's become really in tune with his mental health, right? But I also feel like maybe because it's a young team, maybe it's a team that spent the whole offseason hearing how they're a bunch of bums that they didn't add any true talent to, right? I mean, I think mental health, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's the same on every team, but I feel like it's a more important thing to keep an eye on with this team, right? Jarren Duran, who's blossoming into a superstar, has been upfront about some of the battles he's had keeping his mental health on track. We just saw Chris Martin go on the injured list with the anxiety, right? Tristan Casas is a different cat, right? He likes to sit out there and be very upfront and talk for an entire inning of an ESPN game. And I just feel like Alex has done such a good job, and the whole staff, of getting to know these guys individual. It almost feels like by not having those meetings, you can just have conversations. And some of it's about how you doing, and some of it's about how you're going to approach this guy tonight, right? I think it works for this team.
So what I'm learning is, just from watching these guys, you're not just, it's more than just managing the player, right? You're managing the personality and the human being. Because from my own experience, the anxiety and what comes with playing in the big leagues, and not only the big leagues, but playing in Boston, right? When you're playing in a place like this where there's a ton of pressure on you, everyone has social media. Everyone has access to everything said about you. And though they may tell you, oh, I don't see it, I don't read it, they're human, right? They all see it. They all read it. Maybe not all of it, but they know enough of it. And you hear people in the stands when you're not doing well. So there is a lot of anxiety that comes with playing here, and some guys can't handle it. A lot of guys, even if they can't handle it, they don't talk about it because it's for so long been frowned upon and considered soft. And you're supposed to just keep it to yourself and grind it out and figure it out because you're in the big leagues and you're a man and you just got to do it that way. And that's just how it's always been. It's not true anymore, man. I think so many players coming forward and shedding light on the mental side of the game and the mental struggle because these are still human beings. We fans and everybody around the world puts professional athletes on a pedestal, but at the end of the day, they're still human beings, and these are real feelings, and it's a lot of pressure. And I think having a manager, to your point, TC, that has gone through it and has now been open to us, the media, about what he went through in his playing days, and being aware of what these guys are feeling on a personal level, on a human level, helps him connect with them and get to know them on a personal level.
It is interesting to wind the clock back about a decade. You came up obviously in 2012 on a very veteran team. You remained on a very veteran team in 2013 that was transitioning to being a younger team in 2014. That was not necessarily an easy path. That was not necessarily an easy culture into which to integrate, right? I heard plenty of stuff about how difficult the adjustment was, especially for Mookie in 2014, and how hard that veteran group was on him at times for doing things that he thought, like when he would show up really early for work. He would show up to go to work at like 1 o'clock, and then he would be taking a nap in the clubhouse on the couch when the veterans were showing up to get their work in at 3. And so they thought that was a sign of like great disrespect and crush him, right? Like how much has that landscape changed in terms of how hard veterans are on rookies as they kind of try to figure out their own footing?
Yeah, I think that last, 2012 to like 2015, 16, that last group of really old school grizzled vets, the Josh Beckett's and Lackeys and Lesters, Johnny Gomes, and all these guys who came up with a group that were really hard on them. And then they thought, hey, this is the right way I have to treat the young guys. It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. Not for most guys. It didn't work for me. It made me really uncomfortable, and it
Yeah.
made things tough. I mean, just to be honest, like I wasn't comfortable going to the ballpark, and they didn't want me to be. You have to earn that, right? You have to earn that right to be comfortable. Whether that's putting numbers on the back of your baseball card or just putting the time in and getting service time. It was a dumb unwritten rule. That's it. It's just the way it had always been, and there was no conversation of mental health or an understanding of young players when they're comfortable, they play better and they get more out of themselves. They didn't. That wasn't a thing because it had just never been a thing. So I think once you got, I don't know, 2018, 2019, 2020, around there, I feel like things started to shift. I think that group of players started making their way out of the league. And then there was just a different group of players with a better perspective on how to treat people, right? And how to get, and it starts from the top. It's got to start from a manager. It's got to start from coaches. Veteran leadership has got to understand the human aspect of things. And I think we're finally to that point in baseball where it starts with people being vocal about mental health and understanding when you make someone feel wanted and you're my teammate, you're my buddy, you're my boy, you're going to get more out of that guy. And it's human nature. It's just how it works. And it's starting to bleed into baseball and become normal.
Well, it's interesting because obviously the Red Sox are heavily dependent. Like this is kind of a first half in review. Their success has been heavily dependent upon all of these young players taking that step forward, right? Like it's remarkable. I went through the exercise last week of looking at the preseason player by player projections, offensively at least, and what the reality has been. And basically, what you're seeing is that everyone is outperforming their projections, save for Cedar Rafaela, who's been on the upswing and who's outperforming those projections in the most recent weeks, as well as Emmanuel Valdez, who, again, since being recalled from Worcester, has well outperformed what his projections were. You had that experience in 2012 of having kind of come on like gangbusters, right, and having outperformed projections. When you see a team's success built upon that, should that feel like there's a solid floor in terms of what the formula for Red Sox success has been, or should there be a little bit of like a little bit of concern that like, oh, there is that young players, the ability of young players to sustain that higher level comes with without a firm floor?
I think a lot of these players, what we're seeing right now is who they are. And I think that a lot of that is because of who they're surrounded with. I felt like I was the only guy who hadn't been to arbitration yet. I was constantly in survival mode. A lot of these guys played through the minor leagues together. They rode the buses together. They are family, right? And they're comfortable here. So they're having sustained success at the big league level together. And I feel like when you do that as a group, that's how you start to build kind of, obviously not on the same level as Baltimore. They went through a full tear down rebuild. All these first picks, went through the minor leagues together. They won all the way through the minors together. That's on a whole different level. The Red Sox don't rebuild. They can't rebuild. They can retool, but they still got to be competitive. A rebuild in Boston is hope you 500 and you're competitive in August and September. That's a rebuild in Boston. Let's be honest. So they haven't had the ability to just tear down and have all these first round picks for 5 years and build around them. They've had to take guys and use their scouting department and develop these guys into what they hope they can get the same production out of the first rounders that are running through the Baltimores and these teams that went through rebuilds. And I think at this point, I'm kind of pivoting a little bit, but I think at this point, over the last couple of years, we've been looking at these young guys, waiting for them to bloom and blossom into what we're seeing right now, so that ownership and front office can add to it. And they haven't been to a point where it hasn't made sense to add a ton of talent around what they've had because they didn't really know what they had. So at this point, after Jarren Duran, he showed last year, okay, he can be a really good player. Is that real? Well, yeah, he's doing it again at an even higher level. He's turning into, when we talk about Alex Cora, how he has talked about Jarren Duran being a leader. He's a tone setter. He is becoming a leader in that clubhouse just by the way he puts on his cleats and goes and plays the game. But now it's developing this core of players. You're going to get Tristan Casas back, who's a part of the future. Brian Bayo, who is not. His stuff is so. We can get into this later, but his stuff is so good, and it's just he's like one tiny mechanical fix away from being an ace, is what I feel like. Because the stuff is ace stuff, but in the middle of the plate, he just hadn't been able to command his stuff. So it's like, but he's a part of this. So the point is this group is ready. So at some point, the higher ups, the gods of the Red Sox, have to say it's time to add. This is where you sprinkle in and you go, in my opinion.
But all right, so let's look at that. But Will, let's look at that. Will, I'm going to jump in for a second because my next question fed right off that. I think as we sit here today on FanGraphs, it's a 37.2% chance of making the postseason for the Red Sox, which is way up from what it was 3 weeks ago. Okay, it was down 12. It was down 10 or 12 at one point. And we know, listen, the Red Sox have their own projections, but we know that playoff probability is where it's going to begin. Are they going in or are they not going in? I think they've got 33 games after this Toronto series before the trade deadline. What do you have to go in those 33 games for those gods to look down and say, we will bestow upon you additional help? Because it's not like as good as it is, 37.2% isn't even 50%, right? They're not at this point even 50-50. And I think, I don't know this, Alex, maybe you know this. I don't know if there's a magic number. I don't know if like alarms go off in the Brez suite when they hit 45% probability or, they all of a sudden the phone unlocks so you can call and make a trade. I don't know, right? But it's 37.2% to me sounds right about, I would think you got to be in the 40s for a team to really say, all right, let's go. And they're not there yet. As good as things have gone, as well as they've played, they're not there. So what do they got to do over 33 games to get them to buy?
But every game they win, it goes up, right? Like it's not like he's 37%, just like it didn't stay 11%. You go on a run, you play good baseball, you beat good teams, it goes up. So they're in a really the scheduling gods have really been happy. I mean, look at the schedule they have right now. Over the next, 15 days, where they're in the midst of like 12 of 15 teams they're playing are under 500 after showing, okay, they can beat good teams. And they went through a stretch of a week where they faced a lot of ones and twos from other teams and beat them. Grind it out at bats, use their speed, whatever. We've talked about that. We beat that to death about them using their speed and their personnel. But to your point, it's not only looking at this team, it's looking at the other teams that are going to be in contention for a wild card spot. And I have it up right here. So obviously Minnesota. I don't believe in Minnesota. We've seen Minnesota. They just played Oakland. I don't know how good they are. Does Royce Lewis stay healthy? Does Buxton stay healthy? Probably not. Pablo Lopez has got a 5+. Like, I don't believe in that team. I am worried about the AL West teams because Houston's coming on. You got to think Bruce Bochy's Texas Rangers are going to figure out. They got Scherzer back. DeGrom's going to be back in August. Who knows what happens there? But their offense has severely underperformed. So you got to think Texas turns it on. What does Seattle do? So you got a couple teams from that division have a good chance of going to the playoffs. I'm with UTC. It's right there. So over this next 2-3 weeks, they got to really take advantage of this soft spot and put a little distance between them and some other teams so they don't have to be perfect the last couple weeks before the deadline. Because they're not going to continue on this upward trajectory. The way they're playing right now, they're playing like one of the best teams in baseball right now. They're not one of the best teams in baseball. They're good. They can beat good teams, but they're not one of the best teams in baseball. They can beat you, though, with the way they play. The way they play is really hard to combat because teams don't see teams play like that anymore. So it's hard for teams to figure out how to beat them. So that could be sustainable, maybe. But I'm with you. It's a coin flip right now. I know 37%, whatever. It, to me, more depends on the teams around them for that third spot.
I want to jump in with a couple of rants about probabilities and all of the postseason projections. One, I will note that last year in in the few days before the trade deadline, from a Fangraphs perspective, and again, there are all kinds of public projection systems that have a lot of different projections. Like they can vary. The error bars can be 10% in either direction. So think about that when you're talking through this. But last year, the Red Sox were at like 37, 38% in that last week of July. I think that was a different team, though, right? Like one of the things that is different about this group. Well, there are two things that are different and that we should take stock of whenever we talk about projections. One of them is that projections don't account for, are you good at developing players or not the public ones anyway. So that gets to the question of, do you believe that what you're seeing with this team is real or not? Because right now, for everyone in the lineup, there's a massive regression to the mean that's forecast, right? Because Fangraphs thinks that all of those players are going to be a lot closer to their preseason expectations than to what they've done in the first half of 2024. So do you believe what you've seen in the first half of 2024 on an individual level? Because if so, then the postseason odds start creeping up and up and up. The second thing that's very different to me about this year versus last year is that last year you did have a little bit more of a veteran presence where it was like temporary, right? Like Justin Turner was in many respects, in stretches, their best player. Their most impactful contributor. He was also someone who was going to be leaving after the season, or at least who was going to be arriving at free agency. And he wasn't a core member, right? Like it wasn't a core member who was of their being good. This year, Jarren Duran doing that is a little bit of a different conversation when it's Duran and Devers and then other guys who are controllable for a number of years to come. The other thing that we should factor in is the proximity of what we keep talking about below, and we'll have plenty more on that in the future podcast. But when you think about how proximate Marcelo Meyer and Kyle Steele and Roman Anthony are, that also changes the balance. But I think at its heart, what we see in terms of those public projections isn't necessarily how the Red Sox project it. What looks like the same 37, 38% that the Red Sox have on Fangraphs now, maybe the front office doesn't see it that way. But that's just kind of all tangential to this conversation, just a little bit of context when thinking about some of those probabilities.
Well, I'll jump in there for a second because when you talk about Justin Turner last year, and a different guy in many ways, but you can replace Tyler O'Neill. You can put his name in that place, right? He is not one of the core developing players, right? He's a free agent at the end of the year. Nick Pivetta is a free agent at the end of the year. Chris Martin, Kenley Jansen, free agents at the end of the year. So I think the concern for a lot of Red Sox fans when they're deciding whether or not to invest their time with this team is even if they went 25 and whatever's left, 25 and 8. Okay, let's say 22.
Tom, if they go 25 and 8, then they're like they're pushing all the chips in.
That's a good point. All right, so let's say 20 and 13, whatever I said. Let's say 20 and 13. So they're continually creeping up over time. So you're 13, 14. If you're in the wild card spot, yada yada. You could still, if you're the Red Sox, make an argument that this is all building for next year, and we are disrupting the process by not trading Nick Pivetta and Tyler O'Neill and Kenley Jansen and Chris Martin to get better for 2025 when we think we could contend for something more than just the last wildcard spot. But if you do that, we know the message in the clubhouse, the message to the fans, the white flag waved, here we go again. It's another losing August, the 6th in a row.
I think there's a couple of guys you can trade and be okay. I think the emergence of Justin Slayton and Zach Kelly give you the opportunity to say, we can probably trade Jansen and be okay. And you may not have a strict closer. You may have a couple guys go, between Slayton and Kelly, take that role, or even Bernardino if the pocket shows itself for him, kind of a closer by committee type, which I think they could do. So I think you could move Jansen and be fine. The issue with moving a Pivetta is there's no pitching depth, right? Then you're leaning on Chris Well, Winkowski, Richard Fitz, like in big games in September, which we know it's going to come down to a game probably for a wild card spot. It always does, especially with where this team is at. So I think there are pieces they could move to get a prospect or two and be okay. I don't think they can get rid of all of them. I just don't. Now, I think you need Tyler O'Neill because Yoshida's not giving you anything.
And the difference this lineup with his bat is when he's in the lineup, when he's not in the lineup, it's a completely different lineup. But let's go back to Pivetta real quick, Alex, because that to me, he's the one. To me, you could probably survive any of the three, but I don't think they have the depth of starting pitching to be able to lose a starting pitching like Nick Pivetta. So, Alex, if you had to predict, is Nick Pivetta here in August?
I think that as long as they stay kind of where they are within arm's reach of the wild card race, I don't see how they could punt on that. It would have to be like it would have to be, that you think back to the Orioles a couple of years ago, not in 2023, but instead in 2022 when they actually sold at the deadline, even though they had their core emerging, because they were looking to take the next step organizationally and thinking towards what does it mean to contend for championships perennially versus kind of taking that first step towards contention. And so they traded away like Jorge Lopez at the time and got Cano, who ended up being like a monster for them in 2023. The only way that I see them moving Pivetta is if they're able to simultaneously make a move for a major league ready starting pitcher who's under control for more than 1 year, right? Like I can see that is Craig Breslow has talked about picking a lane, right? He's talked about that with me. He's talked about that with you. Like, we've heard it from him. They've been pretty clear about that. But I do think that there is still, as much as we're now hearing that rhetoric, there's at least a chance that if the Red Sox keep kind of performing in a way that pushes them to upgrade, then they could look into the buy and sell strategy that involves trading a guy like a Jansen and acquiring a starting pitcher who maybe not a prospect, but maybe a guy who's around for 2 or 3 years and under control. That would be interesting and challenging because the cost of those starting pitchers is going to be tremendously high, which is part of the reason why the Pivetta, what could happen with Pivetta as a trade asset is super fascinating, and they are going to be faced with some very, very interesting choices if they continue to be in that like outer lip of contention where it's like in or out of that third wild card spot.
So would you say it's out of question? I mean, obviously it's not out of question. Nothing's out of question. We don't know what Breslow's capable of at this point because he's not as connected to these prospects as Chaim was. What if there is a guy like a Garrett Crochet or a controllable, young, very good top-end pitcher? We have a wealth of position player prospects and now a team full of big leaguers who have solidified themselves as big leaguers, not 4A players anymore, if they stay on this trajectory. So there's guys that are movable, that are prospects in our system, that are highly ranked, touted prospects. Prospects are a flip of a coin. You guys know that. There's guys in the big leagues performing and proving they can play at this level now. Because is there an option here to make bigger splash at the deadline for a controllable arm?
I would have to think that there's, there are interesting questions of like whether or not there is going to be redundancy in the system, right? Because like all of us viewed Kyle Teel as the catcher of the future. Well, what does that mean now with Connor Wong emerging as kind of an almost all-star caliber performer in the first half of this season? Like, what does that mean for that pairing? Does that position you to start thinking about different kinds of trades? And to your point, Will, I mean, it's not just the Red Sox are looking to solidify their rotation for the rest of this season, right? Like there's a big old hole in the long-term outlook of the rotation that it looked like Luis Perales might be getting a little bit closer to maybe as a factor. And no, like now he's basically off the table as a consideration through the end of 2025. So there is, how do you view Richard Fitz? Is he going to, like how big is your need for long-term rotation upgrades? And are you going to be willing to make those kinds of in order to try to land them? When you talk about a Crochet, you are talking about the cream of the crop inside of the Red Sox system, including probably guys at the major league level. But I put it this way: there are a lot of interesting questions to explore that are probably unexpected in terms of how interesting they are.
You're also going up against a team like Baltimore, who has a wealth of upper level elite prospects in their system that they don't have a spot for, and they're looking to trade, and they definitely need an arm after Bradish blowing out. So good luck competing with that too.
You know, we only have a few more minutes. I'm curious as you look back on this first half. It's really hard to do the, who's the breakout star? Because I feel it's 6 guys who are breakout stars or unexpected. But if there's one guy who has impressed you, Will, I'll let you start. Like watching over the first half of this season, like compared to your expectations. Alex talked about what the projections were for everybody. Your personal projections. Your proprietary blend of statistics that go into your preseason expectations. Who's surpassed that, and who's been the biggest surprise?
The easy answer is Jarren Duran, but I'm not gonna say that. I'm gonna go a little deeper. I'm gonna go David Hamilton. I think his ability to not only contribute offensively. I mean, him being able to contribute offensively is what started getting him every day at bats there. Where he was playing sparingly, right? He was playing every 2-3 days. Rafael was playing short, but with Hamilton being able to start hitting, being able to use his speed on the base pass, being disruptive on the base pass, score from first, score from second, that his speed it plays, right? And I think this team is at its best defensive alignment when he's at short. Not because he's an elite defender, because he's not. He's still got a lot of work to do. He's definitely more consistent in making the routine plays now, which is nice, and which. With his offensive production, routine plays are fine for now until Trevor Story gets back. But it allows Cedar Rafael to play his primary position, which is center field. And when you have an outfield of Duran, Rafaela, Wilyer Abreu, that is a very, very good outfield, not only defensively, but you're getting a lot of production offensively. They're all speed guys, and it's a much better team. So I think the emergence of David Hamilton, I mean, you look at, I think it was before May 22nd, he was hitting 231 with like a handful of extra base hits and like 5 bags. Since May 22nd, he's hitting 322, I think, 8 extra base hits, 16 bags. Obviously, he's playing more often, so you can pad those stats more. But he has been an impact player on this team. You've seen him hit 2-hole multiple times. If I told you that last year, or even in the first 2 weeks of this season when he came up, if I told you he was going to be an impactful player on this team, you would have rolled your eyes so far back in your head they would have never come back. Right? So I think I'll say David Hamilton for now as my biggest surprise for sure, and he's turned into a really good ball player.
Alex, who you got?
I would go with Houck. I think that what we've seen, I think that we had gotten accustomed to the idea that he was going to be forever inconsistent over the course of his career as a starter. Like maybe an okay back of the rotation guy who you might be able to get a 5 and dive from, but you always thought that the strike throwing was going to be problematic because there's so many moving parts to the delivery, and that what we had seen over the course of multiple years, even though I think it was underrated, I think it was underappreciated what Houck had accomplished as a big leaguer, like in being a really good big leaguer, one of the best picks from the 2017 draft class, regardless, even before this year. That was a terrible draft class, footnote. To see him outing after outing, pouring the arsenal into the zone, in seeing how far he's come, being able to execute things like the splitter, which was a pitch that he only learned in the alt site, right? Which was an alternate universe of the Twilight Zone. It was like, he's never going to be able to really get like a great feel for the split. Like in 2022, there's just this skepticism about how that would come along as a third pitch. And so you're like, he needs that cutter in order to be able to take the next step. No, the sinker was always going to be good enough. The slider was always going to be good enough. The splitter is now a clear plus pitch. He has 3 plus pitches, and he's in the strike zone because of a couple of tweaks and cleanups that he's been able to accomplish with health. And so I think that for him to be outperforming expectations of being like a solid major league piece to being an elite one through the first half, to me, as much as we're fascinated by Duran, and rightly so, he's been spectacular, especially over the last month or so. To me, Houck has been the cornerstone of their ability to compete this year, because he's the one who prevented things from going off the rails early in the season when the lineup was up and down or in lengthy stretches just completely unproductive. Tom, you
mine
have
is not as impactful as either of yours, but I had no expectations for Zach Kelly this year, and so I'm going with Zach Kelly. He's got more innings in than he had in his career, more major league innings this year already than his career leading up to this season. He's got a little more velo, which is making his changeup that much more effective. He's given him a couple of opening appearances when you kind of watch him and you say, well, could you go Matt Strahm on him? Could you try to make him a starter here in the next year or two? And yeah, let's see. Will says no. But I'll say this. When Will talked earlier about the depth of bullpen arms that allow you to consider the Kenley Jansen trade and the Chris Martin trade, he wouldn't be a closer, but that Chris Martin trade maybe becomes more of a possibility because of guys like Zach Kelly. And Kelly has really become a really good depth arm for them. And at the beginning of the year, let's face it, we didn't know if he'd ever see major league time with this team again.
His sweeper is a new pitch, too.
Yeah.
He didn't throw that last year, and it's really good. Grades out very, very well.
So we'll see.
It speaks to the era of development that we're in. Yeah, where guys remake themselves, and he was very intentional about doing so. He said, I'm giving myself 2 homework assignments: throw harder, develop a sweeper, bang, bang. Look at how he's come back.
All right, we're going to finish the lightning round here. One final question because we're just about out of time. We're sitting here at the halfway point. We talked about our projections versus where they are now. Going to put it on tape, your projections. How many wins and where are they when the postseason begins? I'll go first this time. 88 wins, last wild card spot. Will?
I was going to say 86 wins, last wild card spot.
Can I just say that I hate projections? You know this, Tom. I don't like being on the record with this stuff. That's cold. I will say. Let's see. I will say they're already. Let's go. I'll go with 85, and I will go with 85, and they'll be tied for the last wild card spot, and I don't know whether or not they'll get the tiebreaker or not. How's that?
There you go. I think that is a beautiful.
Just like the Price is Right. You just want to make sure you're a little under so you can win.
Right.
Yeah, there you go.
It's a beautiful example of fence straddling. Well done. With the first debate coming up later this week.
We'll be able to peg it all on what they did at the trade deadline if that happens.
Exactly. And what they did against, Tampa Bay or whoever they're tied with for that final while. They won the series with Minnesota, so they're headed to the playoffs. There you go. Kansas City, those games in August, they're going to be huge. So now we get that to look forward to. Will, this was a lot of fun. We appreciate the visit. We'll have you on again. We'll do it soon.
Hey, thanks for guys.
Well, and again, the makeup removing wipe you stole from my locker at Nesson over the weekend, it's on the house. It's on the 310 podcast, all right? No charge.
We'll call it even. All right. I got to get back to making PB&Js and playing Barbies back there. Anyways.
Remember those game shows? Guests appearing on The Price is Right receive 1 makeup removing wipe from TC's locker. Anytime.
Guys, it was fun. Their contract at Nesson.
Yeah, well, that's between you and them. I have no juice.
Yeah,
you know that well enough.
You got more pull.
For a guy who's closing in on 30 years at one place, I have zero power within the organization that is Nesson. It's really hard to stick around that long and have no influence whatsoever, but here we are. Guys, thank you. Will, we appreciate the visit. It was fun.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
Great to see you, Will.
See you back up here soon. The great Will Middlebrooks, Alex Spear. I'm Todd Karen. We'll see you next time on the 310 to Left podcast.